Hidden in the misty bayous of Louisiana, where the air hangs heavy with secrets, lies a tale so twisted it could only come from the darkest corners of American history. A wealthy planter, blinded by greed and depravity, strikes a forbidden bargain that unleashes a storm of vengeance. But what if the victims turn the tables, erasing not just a man, but an entire empire? Buckle up, this forgotten saga of betrayal and flames will make you question everything you know about power and payback. The narrative of the Harrington dynasty's fall does not begin in 1848, but over a century later, in the summer of 1972, during a state-funded excavation on the marshy grounds of what was once a thriving cotton plantation near the Mississippi River, a team from the Louisiana Historical Society unearthed a small tin box. It had been buried at the base of a fallen chimney, its contents miraculously preserved by a thick layer of hardened linseed oil. Inside, protected from the ravages of time and humidity, was a collection of letters, their paper brittle, but their ink still starkly legible. These were not the records of a plantation owner, but the secret chronicle of an enslaved man. The letters were penned in a precise, almost elegant script by a man named Ezekiel. The first entry, dated May 10, 1848, serves as a chilling prologue to the tragedy that would unfold. Its words, read aloud in the hushed archives of New Orleans, carry the weight of a prophecy. It states with unnerving clarity, he calls himself Colonel Elias Harrington, but the only title history will grant him is that of the architect of his own ruin. The agreement was sealed this evening. 8 of us in exchange for our freedom. The price is his wife's soul. May God forgive us for what we must do and for what we must become to survive this. This opening immediately established a profound mystery. It was not a plea for help or a cry of despair, but a declaration of intent. The document posed a question that would baffle historians for decades. What was this unholy agreement? And more disturbingly, how could an enslaved man, stripped of all power and agency, write with such certainty about the future downfall of his master? The box contained no other context. Only Ezekiel's methodical account of the events that followed, creating a historical vacuum that begged to be filled. The plantation itself, long since reduced to stone foundations and overgrown fields, offered no further clues, its silence as profound as the secrets it kept. The historical setting is crucial to understanding the gravity of Ezekiel's words. Louisiana in 1848 was the epicenter of the American slave empire, a society built on a rigid hierarchy where the power of a white plantation owner was absolute and unquestionable. The Harrington plantation, known as Evergreen, was among the most prosperous. Its wealth derived from the back-breaking labor of over 300 enslaved people who cultivated cotton in the sweltering, disease-ridden bayou country. The Colonel Elias Harrington was a figure of immense social and political influence in New Orleans, a man whose lineage was considered as pristine as the imported marble that adorned his grand home. Within this world of extreme power dynamics, the existence of Ezekiel's letters is a profound anomaly. Literacy among the enslaved was not only rare, but actively suppressed, often punishable by extreme violence. The very act of writing was an act of rebellion, a secret claim to an interior life and an intellect that the system was designed to deny. That Ezekiel possessed not only the skill to write, but also the materials. High-quality paper and ink suggests a level of access and opportunity that defies the brutal logic of the time. His chronicle was, from its inception, a document of impossible defiance. The initial archaeological report from 1972 noted the discovery with academic detachment, cataloging the tin box as a rare example of slave literacy. Yet the contents were so incendiary, so contrary to the established narrative of the antebellum South, that they were quietly archived and seldom discussed. They presented a version of history where the enslaved were not passive victims, but active agents in their own narrative capable of strategic thought and long-term planning. The letters documented a sinister family secret, a tale of moral decay within the heart of the Southern aristocracy, that was far more disturbing than any ghost story. The mystery of Evergreen, therefore, is twofold. It is about the specific events that led to the spectacular collapse of a powerful dynasty. But it is also about the preservation of a truth that should have been lost forever. Ezekiel's Chronicle is the central artifact, a primary source that challenges the official record at every turn. It forces us to ask not only what happened within the walls of that opulent home, but also how this singular voice of resistance managed to outlive the empire that was built to silence it, leaving behind a dark tale of a family destroyed by its own sins. The first letter sets the tone for the entire investigation. It is cold, methodical, and devoid of self-pity. Ezekiel presents himself not as a victim, but as a witness and a participant in a grim transaction. His words are not merely a record. They are an indictment written with the foreknowledge that justice would one day be served even if he were not there to see it. The suspense is born from this very certainty. We are compelled to follow his account to understand the mechanics of this agreement and to discover how it unraveled, leading to the prophesied ruin. The world of Evergreen Plantation, as reconstructed from historical records, was one of outward perfection and inner rot. Colonel Harrington was known for his lavish parties, his political connections, and his ruthless efficiency as a planter. Yet behind the facade of Southern honor lay a man of immense appetites and mounting debts. His story, and the story of the 8 men and 1 woman caught in his web, begins not with a grand historical event, but with a quiet, desperate decision made on a humid spring evening. A decision that would set in motion a chain of events as unstoppable as the tides that flooded the cotton fields. The first piece of corroborating evidence which gives voice to the other side of this macabre pact comes from a source kept separate from Ezekiel's letters for nearly a century. It is the personal diary of Amelia Harrington, the colonel's wife, acquired by the same historical society in 1934 from a distant relative. Its entries were initially dismissed as the melancholic writings of a privileged but unhappy woman. It was only after the discovery of Ezekiel's Chronicle that her words were re-examined, revealing their true and terrifying significance. Her diary entry from May 11, 1848, the day after Ezekiel's, records the first documented anomaly in the Harrington family's public facade. Writing in the delicate, looping script taught in New Orleans's finest finishing schools, Amelia describes the moment the agreement was forced upon her. She does not use direct language. The customs of her time and station would not permit it. Instead, she speaks of her husband's sickly proposal, a plan born from a desperation she could not fully comprehend. She writes of his significant gambling debts owed to powerful men in New Orleans, and of an appetite for novelty that even hell itself could not satisfy. It is here that the motive, so different from the dynastic pressures of other similar cases, is laid bare. This was not about creating an heir, but about settling a debt and indulging a depraved fantasy. The entry lists the names of 8 men: Ezekiel, Benjamin, Isaac, Levi, Reuben, Simeon, Judah, and Asher. She describes them as the finest specimens on the plantation selected by the colonel with the cold detachment of a livestock breeder. Her words are filled with a profound sense of humiliation and powerlessness. The writing of a woman who understood she was as much her husband's property as the men he had chosen for her. She refers to a pact of silence sworn upon a Bible in the colonel's private study, a sacrilegious ceremony that bound them all to a shared sin. This record confirms the core of Ezekiel's claim, but paints it in the colors of coercion and despair. This diary entry is a critical anomaly because it shatters the idealized image of the Southern belle. Amelia Harrington was by all public accounts the epitome of grace and piety, the perfect hostess and the beautiful wife. Her private writings, however, reveal a woman trapped in a gilded cage, forced to become an unwilling participant in her own degradation. Her narrative provides the essential emotional context that Ezekiel's methodical account lacks. We see the agreement not as a strategic maneuver, but as a brutal act of psychological violence inflicted upon her by the man who is supposed to be her protector. The language she uses reveals a deep internal conflict. She describes the men with a mixture of fear and a strange detached curiosity, noting their strength and their silence. She wrestles with the moral and religious implications of her husband's command, filling the page with frantic, half-finished prayers for deliverance. The anomaly here is not just the event itself, but the raw, uncensored record of a woman's conscience being systematically dismantled. It is a first-hand account of the spiritual rot that had taken hold at the heart of the Harrington family, hidden behind a veneer of Southern respectability. Furthermore, Amelia's diary provides the first clue as to how such a secret could be kept. The colonel, she explains, had orchestrated the pact with meticulous care, ensuring that all participants understood the fatal consequences of a single misplaced word. The promise of freedom for the men was a powerful incentive for their silence, while Amelia's own honor and social survival depended on her complete submission. The plan was designed to be a closed system of abuse, a dark secret held in place by a combination of hope and terror, a sinister machine that for a time appeared to be working perfectly. The contrast between her voice and Ezekiel's is stark and revealing. Where he is cold and analytical, she is emotional and tormented. He sees the agreement as an opportunity, a long and dangerous path to freedom, while she sees it only as a descent into a private hell. Yet both of their accounts point to the same central truth. Colonel Elias Harrington was a man who viewed human beings as instruments, tools to be used for his own gratification and financial salvation, whether they were the enslaved men who worked his fields or the wife who shared his name. The discovery of this diary entry, when placed alongside Ezekiel's letter, transforms the investigation. It is no longer just the story of a hidden crime, but the documented account of a complex psychological drama unfolding in one of America's most rigidly controlled societies. The anomaly is the existence of these two parallel narratives, one of calculated resistance and the other of coerced submission, both born from the same foundational act of corruption. It shows that beneath the placid surface of evergreen plantation, a storm of secrets was gathering. This convergence of sources sets the stage for the accumulation of further evidence. The initial shock of the agreement gives way to a sense of dread as we are forced to watch its execution through the eyes of its two most unwilling participants. The documented anomaly is the pact itself, a tear in the fabric of accepted history, revealing a world of private horrors that the official records were never meant to preserve. It is the beginning of a paper trail that will lead inevitably to the complete and utter destruction of the Harrington dynasty. In the weeks that followed the sealing of the agreement, the parallel chronicles of Ezekiel and Amelia begin to document the methodical execution of the colonel's plan. Their writings accumulate entry by entry, forming a detailed and deeply unsettling record of life at Evergreen Plantation. The letters of Ezekiel, written late at night by candlelight in a hidden corner of the carpentry shed, describe the grim routine with the precision of a field report. He details the nights spent in the secluded hunting lodge on the edge of the property, a place far removed from the main house and the prying eyes of the other slaves. Ezekiel's account is chillingly detached. He never describes the acts themselves in graphic detail. The horror is conveyed through his observations of the people involved. He writes of the colonel's presence, a voyeuristic figure watching from the shadows, his face a mask of detached satisfaction. He notes the reactions of the other 7 men, Benjamin's stoic resignation, Levi's barely suppressed rage, and the quiet terror in the eyes of Simeon, the youngest of the group. These letters become a repository for their shared trauma, a secret history of their ordeal that transforms their suffering into evidence. Meanwhile, Amelia's diary entries from the same period paint a portrait of profound psychological disintegration. She refers to the nights at the lodge as her penance, a term steeped in religious guilt. She writes, "I have become a performer in my husband's grotesque theater. I wear the mask of submission, but beneath it, my soul is fracturing." Her entries become shorter, more fragmented, filled with descriptions of sleepless nights and the growing sense of alienation she feels within her own home. She begins to observe the men not as a collective threat, but as individuals, noting Ezekiel's unnerving intelligence and the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. A crucial piece of anomalous evidence appears in the plantation's official ledger for June of 1848. The record, which details all expenditures, shows an unusual purchase: a large quantity of high-quality linen, paper, and several vials of gall ink, materials far too expensive for routine plantation business. The expense is attributed to the Colonel's Office for Correspondence and Record-Keeping. However, a corresponding letter from Ezekiel reveals the true purpose of these supplies. He writes, "The Colonel believes he is in control of this narrative. He does not realize that with every sheet of paper he provides, he is supplying the very tools of his own judgment. I am now keeping the minutes of our degradation." This entry marks a significant escalation. Ezekiel is not merely recording events for posterity. He is consciously building a case. The purchase of the paper, an act of arrogance on the part of the Colonel, becomes a fatal error. It empowers Ezekiel, allowing him to create a permanent physical record of the crime, a weapon that could be deployed at a time of his choosing. The anomaly is the Colonel's blindness. His inability to see that the same tools he used to manage his property could be turned against him by the very people he considered to be property themselves. Amelia's diary also begins to document small but significant changes in the plantation's routine. She notes that the 8 men involved in the pact are being given slightly better rations and are spared the most grueling labor in the cotton fields. On the surface, this appears to be the Colonel fulfilling his part of the bargain, rewarding their complicity. But Ezekiel's letters reveal a different interpretation. He sees these small privileges as a form of control, a way to isolate them from the other slaves and create a climate of jealousy and suspicion, ensuring that their secret remains their own burden to bear. The accumulation of these parallel accounts creates an atmosphere of unbearable tension. We are trapped with the characters in this claustrophobic world, watching the slow, methodical execution of an abhorrent plan. The horror is not in any single act of violence, but in the sustained, systematic nature of the abuse and the psychological toll it takes on everyone involved. The documents show how an initial act of corruption begins to poison the entire ecosystem of the plantation, breeding resentment, fear, and the first seeds of rebellion. Another layer of evidence comes from the tone of Amelia's writing, which slowly begins to shift. Her initial terror and self-loathing give way to something else, a cold, observant anger. She stops writing about her own suffering and begins to document her husband's weaknesses in meticulous detail. His drinking, his paranoia, his increasingly erratic behavior. It is a subtle but profound change. She is no longer just a victim. She is becoming a witness. Her diary transforming from a confessional into a ledger of her husband's sins. This body of evidence accumulated over the summer of 1848 reveals that the Colonel's plan, designed to be a perfect self-contained system of control, was fundamentally flawed. It failed to account for the resilience of the human spirit and the power of the written word. It's created 2 chroniclers of its crimes, each documenting the truth from their own unique vantage point. The letters and the diary read together become a powerful indictment, a chorus of voices preparing to bring down the House of Harrington. The question is no longer if the secret will be exposed, but when and by what means. As the summer of 1848 wore on, the nature of Ezekiel's chronicle began to change. His entries evolved from simple records of events into strategic analyses of the situation, revealing a mind that was constantly calculating, probing for weaknesses in the Colonel's armor. It is within these letters that the first clear hypothesis for revenge is formulated not as a desperate dream, but as a viable tactical objective. The key to this strategy was a profound understanding of the society that had enslaved him and the man who was his master. A pivotal document in this evolution is a letter Ezekiel wrote to Benjamin, one of the 8 who possessed some contacts on a neighboring plantation. The letter, a masterpiece of coded language and careful planning, lays out the foundation of their nascent rebellion. Ezekiel writes, "He promised us freedom as a man throws a bone to a dog." Believing the gift is his to give. He does not understand. Freedom is not a gift to be received. It is a territory to be seized. He thinks his power lies in the whip and the brand, but he is mistaken. The true power of this place, the foundation of his entire world, is not built on violence, but on paper. This passage is the ideological core of Ezekiel's hypothesis. He had correctly identified that the Southern aristocracy's power was an abstraction, a legal and social construct built upon a scaffolding of documents, deeds, titles, ledgers, and family records. The Harrington dynasty was not just a bloodline. It was a collection of papers stored in a locked office, a story written and owned by the colonel. Ezekiel's brilliant insight was that this story could be unwritten. He posits that a single, well-placed act of destruction against these records could do more damage than any physical uprising. The letter continues detailing the first phase of the plan, the systematic gathering of intelligence. He instructs Benjamin to learn everything he can about the layout of the main house, the colonel's habits, and most importantly, the location of his private study. Ezekiel himself begins using his limited access to the house to observe, mapping out the architecture of his own prison. He writes, "Every groan of this house, every look of shame on the mistress's face, every word spoken in drunken confidence by the colonel, all of it is being recorded. This plantation is not built on cotton. It is built on secrets, and we are now its archivists." This is a stunning reversal of power. The enslaved men who were meant to be the objects of the agreement reposition themselves as its subjects, its historians. Their hypothesis is that their testimony, meticulously documented, could become a weapon of immense power. They were creating a counter-archive, a shadow ledger of the colonel's scenes that could be used to blackmail him or, if necessary, to expose him to the world. The act of writing becomes the ultimate act of defiance, transforming their degradation into a source of leverage. Amelia's diary from this period, while not explicitly part of the plan, unknowingly supports Ezekiel's hypothesis. Her increasingly detailed observations of her husband's moral and financial decay provide the very evidence Ezekiel needs. She documents the names of the men to whom the colonel owes money, the dates of his secret trips to New Orleans' gambling dens, and the growing instability of his temper. She is in effect conducting her own surveillance driven by a desire to understand the man who had destroyed her life. Her diary becomes an unintentional pillar of the coming insurrection. The first concrete action born from this hypothesis is the preservation of the letters themselves. Ezekiel describes in detail the process of acquiring the tin box and the linseed oil, methods he learned from the plantation's carpenter. He understood that their story had to be made permanent, durable enough to survive them if necessary. This was not just about escaping. It was about ensuring that the truth would be known, that the historical record would be corrected. The hypothesis was that the truth once recorded takes on a life of its own. This strategic shift marks a critical turning point in the narrative. The story is no longer about endurance. It is about retribution. Ezekiel's letters reveal a sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare. He knew that the greatest fear of a man like Colonel Harrington was not death or financial ruin, but social disgrace. The threat of exposure, of having his depraved secrets laid bare before the prim and proper society of New Orleans, was the most powerful weapon in their arsenal. The plan was no longer simply to escape. 'Twas to dismantle the colonel's world from the inside out. The hypothesis is also deeply spiritual. Ezekiel frequently invokes a sense of divine justice, not as a passive hope, but as an active force that they themselves must enact. He writes, "We will be the agents of a judgment long deferred. Evergreen is the name of this cursed land, and we will see to it that it lives up to its name." This belief transforms their conspiracy from a simple act of revenge into a moral and historical imperative. They were not just fighting for their own freedom, but for a form of cosmic justice against a system that had declared them less than human. The accumulation of these documents, Ezekiel's strategic letters, And Amelia's unwitting intelligence reports creates a palpable sense of a conspiracy taking root. The first hypothesis has been formulated, and the pieces are slowly being moved into place. The tension comes from the immense risk involved. A single mistake, a single discovered letter, would mean a gruesome death for all of them. Yet the sources show no hesitation, only a cold, methodical progression towards a goal that was as audacious as it was brilliant. The complete and total erasure of the Harrington dynasty. The careful planning of Ezekiel and the growing disillusionment of Amelia began to manifest as subtle but significant fractures in the rigid social order of Evergreen Plantation. These disturbances were documented not by the main conspirators but by a third party, Jacob Fletcher, the plantation's overseer. His personal logbook, a dry and factual record of daily operations, unwittingly captures the social decay that was spreading like a fever through the estate during the late summer and early autumn of 1848. Fletcher was a man of limited imagination, but he was a meticulous record keeper. And his observations provide an invaluable outside perspective on the unfolding drama. Fletcher's entries from this period are filled with complaints about a shift in the demeanor of the 8 enslaved men involved in the Colonel's pact. He describes Ezekiel, once a compliant and efficient worker, as possessing a new insolence in his gaze, a quiet confidence that Fletcher found deeply unsettling. He notes that the men no longer feared the threat of the whip, enduring punishments with a stoicism that seemed to rob the act of its power. This change in behavior was a direct result of their secret knowledge. They were no longer just slaves, but soldiers in a silent war. And this new identity gave them a psychological armor that the overseer could not comprehend. The logbook also records a series of inexplicable logistical problems that began to plague the plantation. Small quantities of vital supplies, cured meats, blankets, and most notably medicinal quinine, started to disappear from the storerooms. Fletcher, a man obsessed with order and inventory, was driven to distraction, unable to find the source of the losses. A desperate entry reads, "It is as if the goods are vanishing into thin air. There are no signs of a break-in. The locks are secure." This is the work of a ghost or a devil. He was, of course, partially correct. The ghost was Amelia Harrington. Amelia's diary from the same time reveals her first concrete acts of sabotage. Fractured with guilt and fueled by a growing hatred for her husband, she had begun secretly aiding the men. Using her master keys, she would enter the storerooms at night, taking small, most unnoticeable amounts of supplies and leaving them in a prearranged dead drop for Ezekiel. This was her first step in crossing the Rubicon, a secret alliance that shattered the most fundamental taboo of Southern society. She was no longer a passive victim. She had become an active conspirator. Her actions, a quiet rebellion against her own class. The social fracture was not confined to the relationship between master and slave. It also began to poison the community of the enslaved themselves. Fletcher's log notes increased tensions and fights within the slave quarters. The other enslaved people, noticing the preferential treatment and subtle changes in the 8 men, grew suspicious. The Colonel's strategy of isolating the group had worked, but it also created a volatile atmosphere of resentment. Ezekiel's letters speak of the difficulty of maintaining their secret in this environment, of the constant threat of betrayal from their own people who saw them as collaborators rather than conspirators. A particularly telling entry in Fletcher's log describes an incident where he personally witnessed Amelia Harrington near the slave infirmary late one evening, a place no white woman of her station would ever go alone. He recorded his shock and suspicion, and the next day he confronted the Colonel about his wife's unseemly behavior. According to Fletcher's account, the Colonel did not react with concern, but with a sudden, violent rage. He accused Fletcher of insubordination and threatened to dismiss him, a reaction so disproportionate that it only deepened the overseer's conviction that something was deeply wrong at Evergreen. The Colonel's authority, once absolute, was clearly beginning to erode. His increasingly frequent trips to New Orleans, his heavy drinking, and his volatile temper were signs of a man losing control. The secret he was trying to keep was a heavy burden, and the pressure was causing him to make mistakes. His outburst at Fletcher was a critical error, as it planted a seed of doubt in the mind of the one man responsible for enforcing his will. Fletcher began to watch the Harringtons with a new critical eye, his logbook becoming a chronicle of the dynasty's unraveling. The social fabric of the plantation was tearing at the seams. The clear lines of authority and submission that held this brutal world together were becoming blurred. An enslaved man looked at his master without fear. A mistress secretly aided those she was meant to command, and an overseer began to question the sanity of his employer. These were not small disturbances. They were seismic shifts in the foundations of their world. Signs that the established order was on the verge of collapse. The pact, designed to be a private indulgence, was having profound and public consequences. This period of social fracture is crucial because it demonstrates that the conspiracy was no longer just an idea recorded on paper. It had become an active force, disrupting the life of the plantation in real, measurable ways. The actions of Ezekiel and Amelia were creating ripples of chaos that were spreading outwards, destabilizing the entire system. The tension was no longer confined to the secret encounters at the hunting lodge. It had seeped into the daily life of Evergreen, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion that was palpable to everyone, even if they didn't understand its source. The records from this time, Fletcher's log, Amelia's diary, and Ezekiel's letters combine to form a multifaceted account of a society in quiet turmoil. They show a world where the oppressed are becoming empowered, the powerful are becoming unstable, and the lines of loyalty are being redrawn in secret. The stage was being set for a more direct confrontation, a moment when the hidden fractures would erupt into a full-blown crisis. The social order of Evergreen was a house of cards, and the gentlest of breezes would be enough to bring it all down. The conspiracy reached its point of no return with the creation and dispatch of a single damning piece of evidence. In early October 1848, Ezekiel executed the most audacious step of his plan. He composed a letter not to a fellow slave, but to a known abolitionist in New Orleans, a man whose name he had learned from whispers and rumors. This letter was the culmination of all his intelligence gathering, a carefully constructed bombshell designed to be irrefutable. It contained a concise, factual account of the depraved agreement, the names of all involved, and the location of the plantation. But the letter contained more than just his testimony. In a feat of incredible daring, Amelia had managed to secure a single page torn from the colonel's own private journal. She had found the journal hidden in his desk drawer during one of his drunken stupors. The page she chose was particularly vile, containing the colonel's explicit, boastful descriptions of the nocturnal events at the hunting lodge, written with a chilling lack of empathy. This page, in the colonel's own hand, was the irrefutable proof Ezekiel needed. It transformed his accusation from the word of a slave into a confession from the master himself. Ezekiel's letter to the abolitionist was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It was not a plea for rescue. Instead, it was a cold, calculated proposition. He offered the full story complete with the physical evidence for publication in the Northern abolitionist press. In exchange, he demanded only one thing: guaranteed safe passage for 8 men out of Louisiana. He set a deadline, giving the abolitionist 2 weeks to arrange the logistics. If the deadline passed without a response, he wrote, a second copy of the evidence would be delivered to the colonel's primary business rival. He had created a trap with no escape. The impact of this act on Amelia is documented in her diary with a newfound clarity and resolve. She writes, "I watched him steal the page from my hand, his face as calm as a winter lake. In that moment, I knew I had crossed a threshold from which there is no return. The guilt I carried from my part in this wickedness has finally burned away, replaced by a cold fire. The vengeance Ezekiel seeks is now my own. I am no longer a victim in this story. I am its judge." This entry marks her final transformation. She had shed the last vestiges of her old identity and fully embraced her role as a co-conspirator. The smuggling of the letter out of Evergreen was an operation of immense risk. It was entrusted to a sympathetic freedman who delivered goods to the New Orleans market, a man who knew he would be executed if caught. The successful delivery of the package represents a critical victory for the conspirators. The first time their secret war breached the confines of the plantation and entered the wider world. The existence of that letter, now in the hands of a powerful outsider, fundamentally changed the balance of power. The secret was no longer the Colonel's to keep. This piece of irrefutable evidence is the pivot upon which the entire narrative turns. Before this moment, the conspiracy was a contained internal affair. After it became an external threat, a ticking clock that made the final confrontation inevitable. The Colonel was now living on borrowed time, completely unaware that his private sins had been meticulously documented and were now sitting on a desk in New Orleans, waiting to destroy him. The tension escalates from the personal to the political, as the fate of the individuals becomes entangled with the larger abolitionist movement. Ezekiel's letter also reveals the depth of his strategic thinking. By threatening to go to a rival, he ensured that even if the abolitionist was a man of weak conviction, the fear of a competitor gaining such scandalous information would compel him to act. He had analyzed the power structures of the white world and learned how to manipulate them for his own ends. This was not the act of a simple runaway. It was the calculated move of a political operative. He was using the very tools of the masterclass: information, leverage, and blackmail against them. The impact of this action reverberated through the small group of conspirators. Ezekiel's letters describe a new sense of purpose and unity among the 8 men. The shared risk had forged them into a brotherhood. Their fear replaced by a grim determination. They began to prepare for the final act, training their bodies for the arduous journey north and their minds for the violence that might be necessary to secure their escape. The abstract plan had become a concrete, imminent reality. The existence of this documented proof and the record of its impact on the key players moves the story into its final phase. The pieces are all in place for the endgame. The irrefutable evidence acts as a catalyst, accelerating the timeline and forcing the characters toward their final, fateful decisions. The quiet psychological war of the preceding months was about to erupt into an open and destructive conflict. The only question that remained was how the Colonel would react when he finally discovered that his perfect secret world had been exposed. In the final weeks of October 1848, the carefully constructed authority of Colonel Elias Harrington began to collapse. Not with a sudden bang, but with a series of frantic, desperate actions recorded in the dry, impersonal language of financial ledgers and business correspondence. The pressure of his secrets, combined with the unseen machinations of Ezekiel's plan, was pushing him to the breaking point. His control, once absolute, was unraveling, and the written record of his decline provides a stark portrait of a man besieged by forces he could no longer comprehend. The first clear sign of his desperation is found in the financial records of the plantation for September and October. These documents show a flurry of irrational economic activity. He sold a significant parcel of timberland, a key asset, for a price far below its market value, suggesting a desperate need for immediate cash. He then attempted to leverage a portion of his enslaved population as collateral for a substantial loan from a New Orleans bank. This was a common, if morally repugnant, practice, but in Harrington's case, it was a move born of panic. A letter from his banker dated October 20, 1848 documents the fatal blow to his financial standing. The banker formally refuses the loan, citing not a lack of collateral, but something far more damaging: disquieting rumors concerning the moral and operational stability of the Evergreen estate. The abolitionist in New Orleans had been discreet, but the mere act of making inquiries had been enough to poison the well. The Colonel's name, once a symbol of credit and honor, was now tainted by suspicion. His reputation, The true currency of his power was becoming worthless. This financial collapse was mirrored by a breakdown in his personal authority. Jacob Fletcher's overseer log from this period is filled with accounts of the colonel's erratic and violent behavior. He describes Harrington riding through the slave quarters at night, heavily intoxicated, shouting incoherent threats. On one occasion, he ordered a brutal whipping for a minor infraction, only to rescind the order moments later in a fit of paranoid indecision. Fletcher writes, "The master is no longer in command of himself, let alone this plantation. A rot has taken hold, and it is spreading from the head down." Amelia's diary confirms this descent into madness. She describes her husband as a man haunted, prone to long silences and sudden explosive rages. He had become obsessed with loyalty, accusing his most trusted house servants of spying on him. He had bars installed on the windows of his study, turning his office into a prison of his own making. He was a man living under siege, fighting against a shadow enemy he could not see, never suspecting that the true threat lay within his own home. In the quiet observations of his wife and the secret writings of the men he had abused, the collapse of his authority created a power vacuum on the plantation, and the enslaved community responded in subtle but significant ways. Work in the fields slowed down, tools would mysteriously break. The meticulously managed machine of the cotton plantation began to sputter and stall. This was not an organized uprising, but a spontaneous, leaderless campaign of passive resistance. The slaves could sense the weakness at the top, and they instinctively began to push back against the system that had oppressed them for so long. Ezekiel's letters from this time are filled with a tense, watchful energy. He documents the colonel's decay with the detached eye of a scientist observing a specimen in its final throes. He notes that the time for their final action is drawing near. The colonel's instability made him unpredictable and dangerous, but it also made him vulnerable. Kikyo writes, "His kingdom is crumbling from within. He has become the ghost that haunts his own house. Soon, all that will be left is to sweep away the dust." The time for blackmail and negotiation was over. The only remaining path was liberation through destruction. The documented record of this period is a powerful illustration of how moral authority is inextricably linked to practical power. The colonel's private sins had eroded his ability to command respect and enforce his will. His financial desperation, fueled by his vices, made him a pariah among his own class. His paranoia and violence alienated him from his own staff. He had become an emperor with no clothes, his power revealed as a fragile illusion that could be shattered by a few well-placed whispers and a single damning letter. This collapse of authority is the final prerequisite for the story's climax. It ensures that when the final act of rebellion comes, the colonel will be isolated and weakened, unable to mount an effective defense. The system of control he had built was entirely dependent on his personal authority, and as he disintegrated, so too did the structures of power that kept Evergreen in chains. The stage was set for a final decisive confrontation, one that would take place not on a battlefield, but in the heart of the colonel's own sanctuary, his office. The evidence from this period, the ledgers, the letters, the logs, all point to the same inexorable conclusion. The colonel's world was ending. The authority he had wielded with such arrogance was dissolving like sugar in water. The final entries in the sources from this time are filled with a sense of impending doom. The quiet before a storm that would wash away the name of Harrington forever. The man who saw himself as a master of men was about to become a footnote in the story of his own destruction. In the final tense days of October 1848, with the colonel's authority crumbling and the atmosphere at Evergreen thick with unspoken fear, Amelia Harrington made a discovery that would transform the conspirators' plan from an act of exposure into an act of total annihilation. This discovery is detailed in a frantic yet resolute entry in her diary, an entry that describes her search for the very heart of her husband's power. She was no longer just a provider of supplies. She had become the group's most vital intelligence asset, using her intimate knowledge of the house to find the dynasty's final vulnerability. Driven by a desperate need to understand the full extent of her husband's financial ruin, Amelia began a clandestine search of his private study. 4 nights, while he was lost in a drunken sleep, she meticulously went through his papers, his ledgers, and his correspondence. It was during this search that she noticed a peculiar discrepancy in his accounting books. The ledgers detailing the plantation's assets seemed incomplete, referencing a primary registry that was nowhere to be found. This hidden source, she intuited, held the key to the Harrington family's entire fortune. Her breakthrough came when she was examining a large, leather-bound volume of John Locke's Treatises of Government, a book the Colonel often pretentiously quoted but had likely never read. Tucked inside the back cover, she found not a document, but a hand-drawn map. It was a simple diagram of the study itself, but with one crucial addition: a small X marking a spot beneath a large Persian rug that covered the heart pine floorboards. The map was the key, the hidden source that unlocked the location of the Colonel's most important secret. Following the map's instructions, she pulled back the heavy rug and, using a fireplace poker, found a loose floorboard. Beneath it was a small, iron-lined cavity, a hidden safe set into the very foundations of the house, and inside that safe lay the source she had been searching for. It was not gold or currency, but a collection of documents bound in oilcloth. The original royal land grant for the Evergreen estate, the official deeds of ownership for every acre and every enslaved person, and most importantly, the notarized marriage certificate that legally established the Harrington bloodline. The significance of this discovery cannot be overstated. In an era before centralized records, these original documents were not just symbolic. They were the literal physical embodiment of the Harrington family's wealth and legitimacy. Without them, the Colonel's claim to his land, his property, and even his name was legally tenuous. Ezekiel had hypothesized that the Colonel's power was built on paper. But Amelia had found the bedrock, the foundational texts upon which his entire world was constructed. Her diary entry describing the moment is filled with a sense of awe and terror. She writes, "I held in my hands the history of this place, the ink of kings, the signatures of judges, the names of the dead. He does not keep his gold here, but his very soul. Without these papers, he is not a colonel, not a Harrington. He is a ghost, a man without a past." In that moment, she understood that their plan could achieve something far greater than exposing a secret. They could erase the Harrington dynasty from the historical record altogether. This hidden source fundamentally altered the conspirators' strategy. The plan was no longer about blackmail or public disgrace. Such measures would hurt the Colonel, but they would leave the plantation, the source of his power, intact for his heirs. The discovery of the documents offered a more permanent, more profound solution: the complete and total erasure of his legacy. The new objective was not to expose the man, but to unmake him, to wipe his family's name off the map of Louisiana. She immediately communicated her discovery to Ezekiel. His next letter, the final one in the tin box, reflects this new, more radical objective. He no longer writes of escape as the primary goal. He speaks of a cleansing, a purification by fire. The plan for their final night on the plantation now had a new central objective: the destruction of the study and specifically the contents of the hidden safe. The fire would not be a diversion for their escape. The escape would be the consequence of the fire. The discovery of this hidden source is the final piece of the puzzle, the key that unlocks the story's devastating climax. It provides the conspirators with a clear and achievable objective that strikes at the very heart of their oppressor's power. It transforms their rebellion from an act of personal liberation into an act of historical justice. They were not just running for their lives, they were fighting to control the narrative to ensure that the final chapter of the Harrington story would be one of ashes and silence. Amelia's daring act of espionage elevates her character to a new level. She is the one who finds the enemy's weakest point, the one who provides the means for his total defeat. Her journey from a passive, weeping victim to a determined, resourceful strategist is complete. The discovery of the hidden source is her final act of reclamation, a moment where she seizes control of the history that had imprisoned her and her fellow conspirators. The stage was now set for the final, fiery act of their tragedy. The discovery of the foundational documents in the hidden safe acted as the final catalyst, crystallizing the conspirators' resolve and providing them with a singular, terrible purpose. The decision for decisive action is laid out in the last letter found in Ezekiel's tin box. This document, penned with a steady and resolute hand, is not a plan for escape, but a manifesto for erasure. It details the final preparations for the night of October 31st, 1848. All Hallows Eve, a date chosen for its deep symbolic resonance. Ezekiel's justification for the chosen course of action is articulated with chilling intellectual clarity. He writes, "We have debated the morality of our intended path. To flee would be to grant ourselves life, but it would leave the root of this evil intact. To expose him would be to grant ourselves justice, but it would leave the structures of this place to be inherited by another of his kind. Neither is sufficient. A disease is not cured by trimming the leaves. It must be burned out, root and stem. This house must forget its own name. That is the only true form of freedom." The letter presents the plan with the cold precision of a military order. The action was to commence at the stroke of midnight. The signal would be a single lantern placed by Amelia in the west-facing window of her bedroom. This would indicate that the colonel was in his usual state of drunken unconsciousness. The 8 men would then converge on the main house. Their primary objective was not violence against the Harringtons, but the complete destruction of the colonel's study, the symbolic brain of the plantation. The preparations described are meticulous. For weeks, they had been secretly stockpiling flammable materials. Dried moss, pine resin, and oil-soaked rags hidden in a hollow log near the house. They had studied the patrol patterns of the overseer and his hounds. They had prepared small bundles of food and supplies for their journey north, which were hidden along a pre-planned escape route that would take them through the treacherous coastal swamps. Every detail was accounted for, every contingency considered. This was not an act of chaotic rage, but a coordinated strategic strike. The source provides a powerful justification for the choice of fire as their weapon. Fire, Ezekiel explains, is an element of purification. It does not just destroy, it cleanses. It would turn the records of their bondage, the deeds, the ledgers, the marriage certificate, into meaningless ash. It would erase the colonel's lineage and nullify his wealth. The fire was a tool of historical revisionism, a way to wipe the slate clean. He writes, "They have used the power of the written word to enslave us. We will use the power of the flame to liberate ourselves from that narrative." The suspense in this final letter is built. Through the cold procedural detailing of the preparations, the focus is not on the emotional turmoil of the men, but on the practical steps they were taking to achieve their goal. This detachment makes the plan seem all the more terrifying and inevitable. The men are portrayed as agents of a historical force, their individual fears and hopes subsumed by the larger mission. They were about to commit an act that would see them hunted for the rest of their lives. Yet, the tone of the document is one of absolute certainty. The justification also extends to Amelia's role. She was to provide the signal and ensure the study door was unlocked. After the fire was set, her part in the drama would be to play the role of the hysterical, grief-stricken wife. Her performance designed to deflect any suspicion from herself. It was a dangerous role, requiring nerves of steel. But her diary entry from that final day shows she was ready. She writes, "Tonight I will become a widow. My old life will burn with this house. I do not know what awaits me, but it will be a life of my own making." This final planning document reveals the full scope of the conspirators' ambition. They were not just seeking to escape their own bondage. They were seeking to dismantle the very idea of the Harrington dynasty. Their action was a preemptive strike against the future, ensuring that no son of Elias Harrington would ever inherit the land and the people of Evergreen. It was a radical, desperate, and brilliant plan, a final defiant act of self-determination. The decision for this decisive action, as justified in Ezekiel's final letter, represents the culmination of months of suffering, observation, and planning. It is the logical endpoint of the journey that began with the signing of the depraved agreement. The horror of the climax is foreshadowed not by a sense of impending violence, but by the calm, rational, and inexorable logic of the plan. The narrative has moved beyond the question of if they will act to the terrifying and suspenseful question of how their final judgment will unfold. The sources have laid the groundwork, established the motives, and detailed the preparations. All that remains is the execution. The last letter in the box is a declaration of war, a final testament written on the eve of a battle that would determine not only the fate of the 8 men and 1 woman, but the very memory of the House of Harrington. The air is thick with the smell of pine resin and the promise of fire. The decisive action is set, its justification written, and its consequences are about to be unleashed. The events of the night of October 31, 1848 are not recorded in the chronicles of Ezekiel or Amelia. Their personal accounts end on the eve of the conflagration. The climax of the story, the moment of judgment, is captured in a different kind of document. The cold official transcript of the sworn testimony of Amelia Harrington delivered to the New Orleans magistrate on the morning of November 1st. This final primary source is the most powerful in the entire archive. Its emotional impact derived from the stark contrast between its legalistic format and the explosive confession it contains. The document begins with the dry formalities of legal proceedings. The scribe notes the time, the date, and the names of those present. He describes Amelia's appearance. Her clothes singed, her face smudged with soot, but her posture, he notes with some surprise, was unnaturally erect and composed. The magistrate begins his questioning, treating her as a victim, the grieving widow of a respected, if recently troubled, landowner. He asks her to recount the events of the previous night, which the authorities had already concluded was a tragic accident, or at worst, a violent slave uprising. Amelia's response, as recorded verbatim by the scribe, shatters the magistrate's assumptions. Her voice, the transcript notes, was firm and devoid of any discernible emotion. She begins her confession not with an apology or an explanation, but with a simple, chilling declaration. "There was no accident at Evergreen, sir. Ha! And it was not an uprising. It was a judgment." This statement immediately shifts the tone of the hearing from an inquiry into a tragedy to the sentencing of a crime. She seizes control of the narrative from the very first sentence. She proceeds to give a calculated and partial account of the events. She confesses to setting the fire herself, claiming full responsibility for the destruction of the study and the subsequent inferno that consumed the main house. She describes how she waited for her husband to fall into his usual drunken sleep, how she unlocked the study, and how she used whale oil from the lamps to douse the papers in his hidden safe before setting them ablaze. Her confession is a masterpiece of misdirection designed to achieve 2 goals: to cement her own guilt and to completely exonerate the 8 men. The interpretation of this final source is complex. On the surface, it is a confession of arson, and by extension, the murder of her husband, who was consumed by the flames. But read in the context of the other documents, it is clear that her testimony is a strategic act of self-sacrifice. By claiming sole responsibility, she was creating a definitive official narrative that would end the investigation. A confession from the lady of the house was so shocking, so final, that the authorities would have no reason to look for other culprits, no reason to launch a manhunt for 8 escaped slaves. The magistrate's disbelief is palpable in the transcript. He repeatedly questions her, suggesting she is hysterical in shock or covering for a secret lover, but she remains unshaken. When asked for her motive, she delivers the line that would seal her fate and become a local legend. Colonel Harrington's honor was a fiction. His legacy, a debt paid with the souls of others. I simply foreclosed on that debt. His dynasty began with a signature on a piece of paper, and I decided it should end with fire. In this moment, she is not confessing to a crime. She is pronouncing a sentence. This document is the emotional and narrative climax of the entire story. The fire, the escape, the death of the colonel, all of these dramatic events happen off-screen. The climax is not the action itself, but the telling of it. It is a moment of pure verbal power, where a woman, stripped of all social standing, uses her own confession as a weapon to protect the innocent and to cement the destruction of her oppressor. The horror of the scene comes from the cold, deliberate way she sacrifices her own life and reputation to complete her mission. The interpretation of her final act is left to the historical record. Was she a monster who murdered her husband, a mad woman driven to insanity by grief? Or was she a martyr, a brilliant strategist who understood that her own condemnation was the price of true justice? The official record, of course, would brand her as a villainess of the highest order. But her confession, when read as the final chapter of the story that began with Ezekiel's letters, becomes an act of profound moral courage. The transcript ends with the magistrate ordering her to be taken into custody, her fate to be decided by the courts. Her final words as she is led away are not recorded. Her testimony stands as the final definitive statement on the fall of the House of Harrington. It is a document that closes the case while simultaneously opening up a host of new questions about guilt, justice, and the nature of historical truth. The fire had done its work. The men were free, and the secret of the agreement was now buried under a new, more public scandal of Amelia's own creation. The power of this final source lies in its starkness. There is no narrator to interpret Amelia's motives, no description of her inner thoughts. There is only the cold, hard text of her words, a testament to her final, defiant act. It is the perfect conclusion to a story built on the power of documents. The final word belongs not to the oppressor, but to the woman who orchestrated his downfall. Her confession, a final fiery postscript to a story of impossible revenge. The immediate aftermath of Amelia Harrington's confession and the destruction of Evergreen Plantation is documented in the breathless, scandalized pages of the New Orleans Courier. The newspaper reports from November 1848 treat the story as the society crime of the century. They paint Amelia as a depraved, monstrous figure, a modern-day Medea who had murdered her husband and destroyed her ancestral home in a fit of passion or madness. The press and the New Orleans society it represented could only comprehend her actions through the simplistic lens of female hysteria or infidelity. The legal consequences for Amelia were swift, but their ultimate resolution is shrouded in mystery. Court records show she was indicted for arson and murder. However, there is no record of a public trial. Instead, a brief discreet entry in the docket from early 1849 notes that following: a private hearing where physicians testified to her profound and incurable mental derangement. She was ordered to be confined to a private asylum for the remainder of her life. This was a common fate for inconvenient women of her class, a way to silence a scandal without the mésalliances of a public execution. The financial consequences of the fire were absolute, as Ezekiel and Amelia had planned. The destruction of the original deeds and land grants threw the ownership of the Evergreen estate into chaos. The Courier reports on the protracted legal battles that ensued as distant relatives and creditors tried and failed to produce the necessary documentation to prove their claims. Without the foundational papers, the vast Harrington fortune dissolved into a tangle of legal disputes. The plantation was eventually broken up and sold off in pieces, its name and legacy effectively erased from the landscape. The legacy of the colonel was one of utter ruin. He was remembered not as a powerful planter, but as the foolish, drunken victim of a wicked wife. The rumors of his financial troubles and moral failings, once whispered in private, became public knowledge, ironically cementing his disgrace in the way Ezekiel had originally intended. The name Harrington became a cautionary tale in New Orleans society a synonym for hidden rot and spectacular collapse. The dynasty had not just fallen. It had been rendered a pathetic footnote in its own story. The most significant consequence, of course, was the successful escape of the 8 men. Their fate is much harder to trace, as they were by necessity living in the shadows. There are no official records of their journey. Their legacy is not one of public documents, but of whispers and fragments, clues scattered across the historical landscape. They disappeared from the official history of the South, just as they had planned, leaving behind no trace of their existence, save for the buried letters of their leader. The local legacy of the events transformed into folklore. For generations, the ruins of the Harrington plantation were considered a haunted, cursed place. Local stories spoke of the ghost of a mad lady who could be seen walking the grounds on autumn nights, her figure illuminated by an unseen fire. The story of a slave uprising was forgotten, replaced by the more palatable, more contained narrative of a domestic tragedy. The true complex story of conspiracy and justice was buried beneath a simpler tale of a woman scorned. This transformation of history into legend is a common consequence of traumatic historical events. The community, unable to process the morally ambiguous truth, created a simpler, more supernatural narrative to explain the inexplicable. The ruins of Evergreen became a physical landmark of this collective amnesia, a place where the difficult questions of race, power, and justice were replaced by ghost stories. The true horror of the place, the systematic abuse, and the calculated revenge was too challenging for the local memory to hold. The documented consequences show that the conspirators achieved all of their primary objectives. The men gained their freedom. The colonel's dynasty was destroyed. His legacy was one of shame. And the truth of the agreement was successfully hidden behind Amelia's public confession. The plan, as audacious as it was, had worked perfectly. The cost, however, was the erasure of Amelia from the historical record as anything other than a mad woman and murderer. Her sacrifice was total. The final legacy of the Harrington affair is the archive itself, the tin box of letters, and the forgotten diary. These documents, rediscovered a century later, are the only true monuments to the events of 1848. They stand as a powerful counter-narrative to the official story, a testament to the fact that history is often written by the victors. But the truth is sometimes preserved by the vanquished. The consequences of that fateful night were not just fire and death, but the creation of a secret history, a story that waited patiently in the dark to be unearthed. The story of Evergreen Plantation, as reconstructed from the disparate and long-buried archives of Ezekiel and Amelia, presents a narrative of justice that is as complete as it is unsettling. The historical analysis of these documents forces a revaluation of the traditional power dynamics of the antebellum South. It reveals a world where agency and resistance could be found in the most unexpected of places, and where the tools of the oppressor, literacy, logic, and the written record could be masterfully repurposed into weapons of liberation. The analysis concludes that the fall of the House of Harrington was not an accident of fate, nor was it the simple act of a lone crazed woman. It was the result of a sophisticated, long-term conspiracy orchestrated by an enslaved intellectual and enabled by the moral awakening of his master's wife. This alliance, forged in shared trauma and a mutual desire for justice, represents a profound anomaly in the historical record, a partnership that defied every social, racial, and gender taboo of its time. It was, in essence, a successful small-scale revolution. The figure of Ezekiel emerges as a historical actor of immense significance. He was not just a runaway. He was a strategist, a chronicler, and a political theorist who understood the symbolic and structural nature of power. His letters are not just a testimony of suffering. They are a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. He waged a war of information, a war of psychology, and ultimately a war of historical narrative. He fought not for his own survival, but for the erasure of his enemy, a goal he achieved with devastating precision. Amelia Harrington, in turn, must be reevaluated not as a villain or a victim, but as one of the most complex figures of her era. Her journey from coerced participant to active saboteur to willing martyr is a dramatic arc of moral transformation. Her final act, the public confession, was a calculated move of strategic self-destruction. She understood that in her society, a woman's confession of madness and murder was a more believable story than a conspiracy of intelligent, rebellious slaves. She sacrificed her own name in history to guarantee their freedom and anonymity. However, the historical record remains incomplete, leaving a final, tantalizing open question. While the fates of the colonel and his dynasty are known, the ultimate destinies of the heroes of this story are lost to the mists of time. What became of the 8 men? Did they successfully reach the north and live out their lives in freedom? And what of Amelia? Did she truly live out her days in an asylum? Or was her disappearance from the public record a final, masterful act of escape? A last fragmentary piece of evidence offers a hint, but no firm conclusion. It is an entry in the private diary of a Quaker pastor in Philadelphia dated December 1848. The pastor notes the arrival at his safe house of a small group of runaway slaves from the South. He describes them as 8 silent, haunted men led by one of remarkable intellect and letters who called himself Ezekiel. He mentions they were on their way to Canada. After this entry, they disappear from the historical record entirely. Their freedom seems likely, but their stories are lost. As for Amelia, the open question is even more profound. No grave bearing her name has ever been found. The records of the asylum where she was supposedly confined are conveniently missing for that year. This absence of evidence has led some historians to a radical hypothesis that her confinement was a fiction, a story created by powerful family members to manage the scandal, and that she was quietly exiled. Or perhaps with the help of the same abolitionist network that aided Ezekiel, engineered her own disappearance. This ambiguity is perhaps the most fitting end to her story. By taking public blame, she ensured that the truth of the conspiracy would remain hidden. But she may have also secured her own anonymous freedom. Her legacy then is not one of infamy, but of a profound and unanswered question. Did she sacrifice everything, or did she in the end manage to save herself as well? The documents do not say. The story ends where it began, with a collection of powerful but incomplete records. The final analysis, therefore, is that the Harrington affair is a testament to the truths that lie buried beneath the official narratives of history. It reminds us that archives are never complete and that the past is a place of shadows and secrets, where the most important stories are often the ones that were never meant to be told. The open question of what truly became of Ezekiel and Amelia ensures that their story remains alive, a permanent and unsettling mystery in the long, dark litany of American sin. If this chilling tale of hidden horrors and ultimate revenge kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and subscribe for more unearthed mysteries from America's shadowy past. Drop a comment. Do you think Amelia escaped her fate? Hit the bell so you never miss the next deep dive into forgotten darkness. Stay curious. History buffs, there's always more lurking in the archives.